The Winchester rifle cracked across the canyon, its echo rolling between stone walls like thunder. Patricia Hernandez worked the lever with fluid precision, the brass cartridge spinning through morning air as she tracked her next target. Three men lay motionless in the rocks below, their overconfidence buried with them in the high desert dust. James Gonzalez pressed himself deeper into the boulder field, sweat cutting tracks through the grime on his face. The woman they had dismissed as a broken-down widow now hunted them with the methodical patience of a predator born to these mountains. His remaining men scattered like quail, their bravado evaporating under her relentless accuracy. You should have listened, Patricia thought, settling the rifle stock against her shoulder. The crosshairs found Gonzalez as he broke cover, running for his horse. She led him by 2 feet, accounting for the downhill angle and morning wind. Her finger found the trigger. The shot took him clean through the chest, dropping him 20 yards from salvation. Patricia worked the lever again, brass singing its familiar song. Silence settled over the canyon like a shroud, broken only by the whisper of wind through juniper and the distant cry of a hawk. She had warned them. 3 days ago they could have ridden away. Now the buzzards would feast. Patricia lowered the Winchester and began the climb down to collect what remained of her stolen horses. The legend of the territory ghost lived again, written in gun smoke and justice across the unforgiving stone. But this story began much differently, in the quiet hours before dawn when Patricia Hernandez was nothing more than a widow trying to survive another day in the high country. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. Now let us go back to where it all started. The rooster crowed as Patricia stepped onto her porch, coffee steaming in the tin cup between her weathered hands. Dawn painted the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in shades of gold and amber. Another day beginning in the territory that had claimed her husband and nearly broken her spirit. She sipped the bitter brew and studied the horizon with eyes that missed nothing. Her homestead sat in a natural bowl between 2 ridges, accessible by a single narrow trail that wound through pine and aspen. Most folks called it isolated. Patricia called it defensible. Old habits died hard, even after 7 years of trying to bury them under the routine of ranch work and solitude. She walked to the corral where her horses waited for morning grain. Black Tusk nickered at her approach, the stallion magnificent even in his advancing years. His coat gleamed like polished obsidian in the early light, muscles rippling beneath skin that bore the scars of wild country and wilder times. He had been her husband Marcus's pride, and now he was all she had left of the man who had known her secrets and loved her anyway. Patricia ran her hand along the stallion's neck, feeling the familiar comfort of his strength. Black Tusk had carried her through country that would kill lesser horses, had stood steady under rifle fire when her past caught up with her in places where law meant nothing and survival meant everything. Now he grazed peacefully in her small valley, content to grow old with the woman who understood that some bonds transcended death. The other horses clustered around the feed trough as she distributed hay and oats. A dozen head of good mountain stock, bred for endurance and sure footing in country where a stumble meant a 1,000-foot fall. They represented 7 years of careful breeding and patient training, her only source of income since Marcus died. As the horses fed, Patricia walked her fence line with the automatic precision of someone who knew that details meant survival. The post stood straight and true, wire stretched tight against the mountain wind. No breaks, no signs of tampering. She checked each gate, each latch, running her fingers over metal worn smooth by years of use. At the far corner of her property, where the trail from town wound through a stand of ponderosa pine, Patricia knelt to examine the ground. Fresh tracks marked the soft earth beside the creek. 3 horses, shot on, moving at a steady walk toward her homestead before turning back. The riders had stopped here, studying her place from the tree line. Patricia rose slowly, her hand drifting unconsciously to her hip where a gun belt had once rested. The gesture felt foreign now, like reaching for a phantom limb. She had put that life behind her when she married Marcus, trading badge and bullets for love and the hope of peace. But the instincts remained, sharp as broken glass beneath the surface of her carefully constructed new identity. She followed the tracks back toward the main trail, reading the story written in hoofprints and disturbed earth. The horses were well fed, their riders confident enough to approach in daylight. Not drifters or desperate men, but professionals with a purpose. The kind of men who studied their targets before making a move. Patricia straightened, brushing dirt from her knees. 7 years of peace had made her soft, or so she had hoped. But the old skills surfaced like muscle memory, unwelcome and undeniable. She could track these men to their camp, identify them by their horses, predict their next move with the certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime hunting and being hunted. Instead, she turned back toward her cabin. Whatever brought strange riders to scout her homestead could wait. She had horses to tend and a life to maintain, even if that life suddenly felt as fragile as morning frost. The sun climbed higher as Patricia worked, mucking stalls and checking water troughs with the steady rhythm of routine. But her attention kept drifting to the tree line, searching for movement that did not belong. The horses sensed her tension, ears pricked and alert as they followed her gaze toward the pines. By noon, the riders returned. 3 men emerged from the tree line with the casual arrogance of those accustomed to taking what they wanted. Patricia recognized the type immediately, professionals who traded violence for coin and believed that might made right. They rode good horses and carried themselves with the confidence of men who had never met serious opposition. The leader sat a bay gelding with military precision, his back straight and eyes cold as winter stone. James Gonzalez wore a black coat despite the mountain heat, his hat pulled low over features that spoke of too many years solving problems with bullets. The men flanking him looked like hired muscle, the kind who asked no questions and left no witnesses. Patricia set down her pitchfork and walked to meet them, her movements deliberate and calm. She had learned long ago that panic was a luxury she could not afford, that survival often depended on appearing weaker than you were while calculating exactly how dangerous you needed to become. Gonzalez reined in 10 feet from her porch, close enough to intimidate, but far enough to avoid seeming overtly threatening. A professional courtesy between predator and prey, the dance of violence that always preceded bloodshed. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a mockery of respect. "Beautiful spread you have here. Quiet, peaceful. Be a shame if something happened to disturb that peace." Patricia met his gaze without flinching. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" "We represent certain business interests in the territory," Gonzalez continued, his voice smooth as silk over steel. "There's been some concern about property values in this area. Seems like folks might be better served selling out and moving somewhere more suitable for a woman alone." "This is my home," Patricia replied quietly. "My husband and I built this place with our own hands. I am not interested in selling." The man to Gonzalez's left, a thick-set brute with scarred knuckles, shifted in his saddle. "Your husband ain't here to protect you now, lady. Things change. Smart folks adapt." Patricia's hand moved fractionally closer to the axe handle leaning against her porch rail. The motion was so slight that only a trained observer would notice, but it spoke volumes to anyone who knew how to read the language of violence. "My husband taught me to take care of myself," she said, her voice carrying a note of steel beneath the surface calm. "I suggest you move along before this conversation becomes unpleasant for all of us." Gonzalez laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin cup. "Ma'am, I think you misunderstand the situation here. We're not asking, we're telling. You have 1 week to pack up and clear out. After that, well, accidents happen in country this remote." He wheeled his horse around, signaling his men to follow. As they rode toward the tree line, Patricia heard him call back over his shoulder. "Oh, and ma'am, that black stallion of yours, beautiful animal. Shame if something happened to him while you were making up your mind." Patricia stood motionless until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Then she walked slowly to her cabin, each step measured and deliberate. Inside, she moved to the stone fireplace and knelt beside the hearth. Her fingers found the loose stone Marcus had shown her on their wedding night, the hiding place he had insisted on even as they dreamed of leaving violence behind forever. The stone came free with a grinding whisper, revealing the oiled leather bundle hidden within. Patricia lifted it with hands that remembered its weight, its significance, its terrible necessity. 7 years of dust covered the leather, but the contents remained pristine, waiting for the day she hoped would never come. She unwrapped the bundle slowly, each layer revealing artifacts of a life she had tried to forget. The silver badge marked with the eagle and shield of the United States Marshal Service. The leather gun belt worn smooth by years of use. The Colt Peacemaker with ivory grips, its actions smooth as silk and deadly as winter. At the bottom of the bundle lay a photograph, creased and faded but still clear enough to show a younger Patricia standing beside 5 other people in front of a territorial courthouse. The caption read, Territory Marshal Patricia Hernandez and Special Investigation Unit, 1878. She had been the territory ghost then, the marshal who could track anyone across any terrain, who could put 6 shots through a silver dollar at 100 yards, who had brought justice to places where law was nothing but a word. Outlaws told stories about her around campfires, legends that grew with each telling until she became more myth than woman. Patricia set the photograph aside and lifted the Colt, checking the action with movements as natural as breathing. The gun felt strange in her hand, foreign after 7 years of deliberate disuse, but the muscle memory remained. She could still draw and fire in less than a second, could still read sign that others missed, could still track a man across stone and through running water. But she was Patricia Hernandez, the widow now, not the territory ghost. She had chosen love over duty, peace over justice, a quiet life over the endless cycle of violence that had defined her younger years. Marcus had given her that choice, had loved her enough to help her bury the past beneath dreams of a different future. Now strangers threatened to take even that away. Patricia rewrapped the bundle and returned it to its hiding place. She would try reason first, would hope that Gonzalez and his men would see wisdom in leaving her alone. But if they pushed, if they threatened what little remained of the life she had built, then the territory ghost would ride again. Some things were worth killing for, some things were worth dying for, and some things, once taken, demanded blood in return. The next morning brought clouds heavy with the promise of snow, winter arriving early in the high country. Patricia worked in the dim light before dawn, her breath forming white plumes as she fed the horses and checked their hooves for stones. The routine felt different now, charged with the tension of waiting for the other boot to drop. She had spent the night thinking about Gonzalez and his men, analyzing their approach and demeanor with the cold calculation of someone who had spent years studying predators. They were professionals, but they were also arrogant. They had dismissed her as a helpless widow, a mistake that might prove fatal if they pushed too far. As she mucked Black Tusk's stall, Patricia noticed the stallion's restlessness. His ears swiveled constantly, tracking sounds she could not hear. Horses possessed senses that humans had lost to civilization, instincts that warned of danger long before it became visible. Black Tusk had saved her life more than once during her martial days, his warnings as reliable as gospel. She finished her chores and walked to the cabin for breakfast, but stopped when she saw the envelope nailed to her door. Her name was written across it in careful script, the paper expensive and the handwriting educated. Patricia pulled the nail free and opened the envelope, reading the contents twice before the full meaning sank in. Mrs. Hernandez, the letter began, your presence in this territory has become inconvenient for certain business interests. A generous offer has been made for your property, one that should be more than sufficient to relocate somewhere more suitable for a woman of your circumstances. Failure to accept this offer within the specified time frame will result in consequences that we would all prefer to avoid. The choice is yours, but choose wisely. Time is not your ally in this matter. It was unsigned, but the message was clear enough. Someone wanted her land badly enough to hire professionals, and they were growing impatient with her refusal to cooperate. Patricia crumpled the letter and let the mountain wind carry the pieces away like snow. She spent the day checking her defenses with eyes that had not looked upon her homestead as a fortress for 7 years. The cabin sat with its back to a sheer rock wall, accessible only from the front. The corral offered good cover and multiple escape routes. The well was positioned to be defended from the house. Marcus had chosen the location well, even if he had hoped never to need its tactical advantages. That evening, as purple shadows gathered in the valley, Patricia heard the sound she had been dreading. Hoofbeats on the trail, moving fast and purposeful. She counted at least 6 riders, maybe more, approaching under cover of gathering darkness. Patricia moved to the window and watched them emerge from the trees. Gonzalez led the group, but he had brought reinforcements. Hard men with the look of those who killed for money, the kind who would burn her cabin and scatter her bones without losing a moment's sleep. They stopped at the edge of her property, close enough to be seen but far enough to avoid rifle range. Gonzalez called out across the distance, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. Mrs. Hernandez, I trust you received our message. Have you given thought to our generous offer? Patricia stepped onto her porch, standing in the yellow light that spilled from her windows. I told you yesterday, this is my home. I am not leaving. Pity, Gonzalez replied. We had hoped you would be reasonable. Unfortunately, our employers are not patient men. They require results, not excuses. He gestured to his men, and Patricia watched them spread out in a loose semicircle around her property. Professional positioning, designed to prevent escape while maintaining fields of fire. These were not common outlaws or desperate drifters. Someone had hired experienced killers to remove her from the equation. You have until sunrise, Gonzalez continued. Pack what you can carry and ride out. Leave the horses. Consider them payment for the inconvenience you have caused. And if I refuse, Patricia asked, though she already knew the answer, then we will remove you ourselves. And Mrs. Hernandez, when we do, it will not be pleasant. We have our orders, but those orders leave considerable room for interpretation. Patricia felt something cold and familiar settle in her chest, a calm that had nothing to do with acceptance and everything to do with preparation. She had faced men like Gonzalez before, had looked into eyes that held no mercy, and found her own reflection staring back. You should know, she said quietly, that some things should not be taken. You are about to take one of them. Gonzalez laughed, the sound harsh in the mountain stillness. Ma'am, you are one woman alone against 8 professional fighters. Whatever you think you can do, I assure you that you are mistaken. Patricia met his gaze across the distance, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. My name is Patricia Hernandez. Before I came here, before I was a widow trying to live in peace, I was something else. They used to call me the Territory Ghost. Perhaps you have heard the stories. The laughter died on Gonzalez's lips. Even in the gathering darkness, Patricia could see the change in his posture, the sudden tension that ran through his men like electricity. The Territory Ghost was legend in these parts, a name spoken in whispers around outlaw campfires and in the back rooms of territorial saloons. You are lying, Gonzalez said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Tomorrow at dawn, you will discover the truth of that statement, Patricia replied. I suggest you use the remaining hours to make peace with whatever gods you serve. She turned and walked back into her cabin, leaving Gonzalez and his men to contemplate the implications of what she had just revealed. Behind the closed door, Patricia moved with swift efficiency to the fireplace and retrieved her hidden bundle. The time for pretense had passed. The Territory Ghost would ride again, and hell would follow in her wake. Patricia worked through the night with the methodical precision of someone who had prepared for war many times before. She cleaned and loaded the Colt Peacemaker, checking each cartridge and testing the action until the gun felt like an extension of her hand. The Winchester came next, its lever smooth as silk after years of careful maintenance. 40 rounds for the rifle, 18 for the pistol. Enough to end this, one way or another. She moved furniture to create firing positions, angling the heavy oak table to provide cover while maintaining clear sight lines through the windows. The cabin Marcus had built with love would become a fortress, its thick log walls capable of stopping anything short of a cannonball. As she worked, Patricia thought about the men waiting in the darkness beyond her property line. Gonzalez was no fool, whatever his other failings. He would have heard the stories about the Territory Ghost, would know that legends were built on foundations of blood and skill. But he was trapped now by his own arrogance and his employer's demands. He could not retreat without losing face, and men like Gonzalez valued reputation above life itself. The horses sensed the coming violence, stamping and snorting in their corral. Black Tusk stood apart from the others, his head high and ears pricked forward like a cavalry mount waiting for the charge. Patricia wished she could turn them loose, let them run free rather than risk them in the crossfire. But the corral offered the only cover between the cabin and the tree line. She would need that cover when the shooting started. Dawn approached with the inexorable certainty of Judgment Day. Patricia took her position at the front window, the Winchester cradled in her arms like an old friend. She had not killed a man in 7 years, had hoped never to kill again. But some choices were made for you by the actions of others, and some debts could only be paid in blood. The first shot came with the sunrise, a rifle bullet that splintered wood inches from her head. Patricia dropped below the windowsill and crawled to her prepared position behind the overturned table. Through a gap in the logs, she could see muzzle flashes winking in the tree line like deadly fireflies. Gonzalez had positioned his men well, spreading them in an arc that covered all approaches to the cabin. But he had made one crucial mistake. He had assumed that Patricia would cower inside her home, waiting for them to close the distance and finish her. He did not know that the territory ghost had never been hunted because she had always been the hunter. Patricia waited until the shooting slackened, then moved like smoke through the cabin to the back window. The sheer rock wall behind her house offered no escape route, but it did provide something else. A narrow ledge that ran along the base of the cliff, invisible from the front of the property, and wide enough for someone who knew how to move in dangerous country. She slipped through the window and onto the ledge, the Winchester slung across her back and the Colt in her hand. The rock was slick with morning dew, treacherous in the half-light of dawn, but Patricia had walked more dangerous paths in her time as a marshal. She moved with the silent grace of someone who had learned that noise meant death, following the ledge as it curved around the base of the cliff. The shooting continued, Gonzalez's men pouring lead into an empty cabin, while their targets circled behind them like a ghost made flesh. Patricia reached the end of the ledge and dropped into a ravine that ran parallel to the tree line. Now she was the hunter, and they were the prey. She could hear them calling to each other, coordinating their advance with the discipline of experienced fighters. But discipline meant nothing when your enemy was where you did not expect her to be, when the hunted had become the hunter and death stalked on silent feet. Patricia climbed out of the ravine 50 yards behind their line, the Winchester in her hands and vengeance in her heart. The first man never knew what killed him, the bullet taking him between the shoulder blades as he advanced toward her empty cabin. The second spun at the sound of the shot, just in time to see the muzzle flash that ended his life. Now they knew where she was, and the real fight began. Gonzalez's remaining men turned like a pack of wolves, their rifles seeking the source of death that had appeared behind them. But Patricia was already moving, using trees and rocks for cover as she worked the Winchester's lever with mechanical precision. Each shot found its target, each target dropped where he stood. The territory ghost had returned, and she had forgotten nothing. A bullet clipped bark from the pine beside her head, close enough that she felt the sting of wood fragments against her cheek. Patricia rolled behind a boulder and counted muzzle flashes. 4 men left, including Gonzalez. Professional spacing, good cover discipline. They were learning fast, but not fast enough. She heard movement to her left, boots on stone as someone tried to flank her position. Patricia smiled grimly and drew the Colt, waiting with the patience of a mountain cat. The man appeared between 2 trees, his rifle raised and ready. Patricia's shot took him center mass, the heavy .45 caliber bullet dropping him like a stone. 3 left. The shooting stopped abruptly, silence falling over the battlefield like a shroud. Patricia reloaded the Winchester with practiced efficiency, her eyes never leaving the tree line where Gonzalez and his remaining men had taken cover. She could hear them talking, their voices low and urgent, as they realized the true scope of their mistake. "Mrs. Hernandez," Gonzalez called out, his earlier confidence replaced by the desperate edge of a man who had finally understood his situation. "Perhaps we can reach an accommodation. My employers might be willing to reconsider their position." Patricia worked the Winchester's lever, the metallic sound echoing through the trees like a death knell. "The time for talk has passed," she replied. "You should have listened when I gave you the chance." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant cry of a hawk. Patricia knew they were planning something, some desperate gambit to turn the tables. But she had fought desperate men before, and desperation made them predictable. When they came together, 3 men breaking cover in a coordinated rush designed to overwhelm her position through sheer firepower. It was a good plan, the kind that might have worked against an ordinary opponent. But the territory ghost was far from ordinary, and she had been expecting exactly this kind of move. Patricia rose from behind her boulder like an avenging angel, the Winchester speaking its deadly language with mechanical precision. The first man fell before he had taken 3 steps, her bullet finding the gap between his ribs with surgical accuracy. The second managed to get off a wild shot before her next round took him in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him face first into the pine needles. Gonzalez kept coming, his rifle blazing as he charged through the smoke and chaos of his dying men. Patricia could see the madness in his eyes, the desperate fury of a predator who had finally met something more dangerous than himself. His bullets whined past her head, close enough to part her hair, but Patricia held her ground with the cold calm of someone who had danced this dance many times before. She worked the Winchester's lever and found the chamber empty, the rifle clicking uselessly as Gonzalez closed the distance between them. Without hesitation, Patricia dropped the long gun and drew the Colt Peacemaker, the familiar weight settling into her hand like an old friend coming home. Gonzalez was 20 feet away when she drew, 15 when the Colt cleared leather, 10 when her thumb found the hammer. He managed to get off one more shot, the bullet tugging at her sleeve, before Patricia's .45 caliber response ended the conversation permanently. The echoes of gunfire faded into mountain silence, leaving only the whisper of wind and the distant sound of running water. Patricia stood among the bodies of her enemies, smoke rising from the barrel of her pistol like incense in a church of violence. 8 men had come to kill her, and 8 men would feed the buzzards before the day was done. She holstered the Colt and walked back toward her cabin, stepping carefully around the corpses that littered the ground like broken dolls. The horses had huddled together during the shooting, but Black Tusk stood apart, his dark eyes fixed on her with something that might have been approval. He had seen her like this before, had carried her through battles that lesser animals would not have survived. Patricia checked each body to make certain they were dead, a precaution that had saved her life more than once during her martial days. She found papers in Gonzalez's coat pocket, letters that confirmed what she had already suspected. Someone with money and influence wanted her land, wanted it badly enough to hire professional killers to remove an inconvenient widow. The letters were signed with the name Lewis Clark, owner of the Territorial Mining Consortium. Patricia knew the name, had heard it whispered in the same breath as corruption and murder. Clark owned judges and politicians, controlled vast stretches of territory through fear and violence. He was the kind of man who took what he wanted and killed anyone who stood in his way. But he had made one crucial mistake. He had underestimated Patricia Hernandez, had dismissed her as a helpless widow when she was something far more dangerous. The Territory Ghost had a reputation to maintain, and that reputation was built on the simple principle that some debts could only be paid in blood. Patricia gathered the weapons from the dead men, a small arsenal of rifles and pistols that spoke to the serious nature of their mission. She dragged the bodies to a ravine where the coyotes and vultures could dispose of them, erasing the evidence of the morning's work. Let Clark wonder what had happened to his hired killers. Let him lie awake at night wondering if the Territory Ghost was coming for him. As she worked, Patricia felt the familiar weight of her old life settling around her shoulders like a well-worn coat. 7 years of peace had been a gift, a respite from the endless cycle of violence that had defined her younger years. But that peace had been built on the foundation of others' fear, the knowledge that the Territory Ghost slept lightly and woke with guns in her hands. Now that sleep was over and the ghost walked again, she spent the rest of the day preparing for what would surely come next. Clark would not accept the loss of his men without retaliation, would not allow a mere widow to defy his will. He would send more killers, better killers, and they would come with the knowledge that their target was far more dangerous than she appeared. But Patricia was no longer hiding behind the mask of widowhood. The Territory Ghost had returned, and she would finish what Lewis Clark had started. Some men needed killing, and Clark had just moved to the top of that list. As evening painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Patricia stood on her porch and watched the horizon for signs of movement. The wind carried the scent of snow and the promise of winter, but it also carried something else. The smell of fear, sharp and acrid, drifting down from the high country where men with guilty consciences slept poorly and woke to check their locks. Tomorrow she would ride to town, would begin the hunt that would end only when Lewis Clark lay dead in the dust. The Territory Ghost had unfinished business, and she always collected her debts in full. Black Tusk nickered softly from the corral, as if he understood that their quiet days were over. Patricia smiled grimly and checked the loads in her weapons one more time. The legend was about to become reality again, and the Territory would remember why they had called her the Ghost. Some things, once awakened, could never sleep again. The town of Silverton huddled in the valley like a collection of broken teeth, its buildings weathered gray by mountain winters and summer storms. Patricia rode down the main street on black tusks, the stallion's hooves ringing against the frozen ground with metallic precision. Faces appeared in windows and doorways, drawn by curiosity in something deeper. Word traveled fast in small towns, and the story of 8 dead men found in a ravine had already made its way down from the high country. Patricia tied black tusk to the rail outside the Silver Dollar Saloon and stepped onto the boardwalk, her boots echoing in the sudden silence that had fallen over the street. She wore her gun belt openly now, the Colt Peacemaker riding low on her hip where everyone could see it. The time for pretending to be helpless was over. Inside the saloon, conversations died as she pushed through the batwing doors. The bartender, a heavy-set man named Jerry Ramos, polished a glass with hands that shook slightly as he watched her approach. Patricia had known Jerry for 7 years, had bought supplies from him and shared occasional pleasantries about weather and horses. Now he looked at her as if she were a stranger, someone he had never really known at all. "Whiskey," she said quietly, laying a silver dollar on the scarred wooden bar. Jerry poured with the careful precision of someone trying not to spill anything, his eyes never quite meeting hers. The other patrons gave her a wide berth, their conversations resuming in hushed tones that carried the electric tension of fear and fascination. Patricia sipped her whiskey and studied the room in the mirror behind the bar. Miners and cowboys mostly, honest men trying to make a living in hard country. But there were others, men with the soft hands and calculating eyes of those who profited from others' labor. Clark's men, watching and waiting for their chance. She finished her drink and walked to a table in the corner where a man sat alone, nursing a beer and trying to look invisible. Mark Myers had been her deputy during the last years of her marshal service. A steady hand with a rifle and the kind of loyalty that could not be bought or broken. He had aged in the 7 years since she had hung up her badge, his hair gone gray at the temples and lines etched deep around his eyes. "Hello, Mark," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "Patricia," he replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Heard you had some trouble up at your place. Nothing I could not handle. But it is not over. Lewis Clark wants my land, and he is not the type to accept defeat gracefully." Mark nodded slowly, his fingers drumming against the table in a nervous rhythm. "Clark owns this town, Patricia. Owns the judge, the sheriff, half the territorial government. You cannot fight him alone." "I am not alone," Patricia said quietly. "The old network is still out there, Mark. Men and women who remember what we stood for, who remember that some things are worth fighting for regardless of the odds." She reached into her coat and pulled out a small silver token, placing it on the table between them. Mark stared at it for a long moment, recognition dawning in his eyes. It was a marshal's call coin, issued only to members of the Special Investigation Unit. The coin meant that the territory ghost was riding again, and all debts were called due. "How many?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "As many as answer the call," Patricia replied. "Clark has made this personal, and personal debts require personal payment." Mark picked up the coin and turned it over in his fingers, feeling the weight of memory and obligation. He had followed Patricia through hell during their marshal days, had seen her track killers across impossible terrain and bring justice to places where law was just a word. She had never asked him to do anything she would not do herself, had never led him anywhere she was not willing to go first. "What do you need?" he asked finally. "Information. Clark's operation, his men, his weaknesses. And I need it fast. He will not wait long for sending more killers." Mark nodded and pocketed the coin. "I will put out the word quietly. The old network still has eyes and ears in places Clark does not expect. Give me 2 days." Patricia stood and placed a hand on his shoulder. 2 days then? And Mark, when this is over, when Clark is dead and buried, we go back to being retired. I have had enough of this life to last several lifetimes." As she walked toward the door, Patricia felt the weight of watching eyes following her movement. Clark's men would report her presence in town, would tell their boss that the territory ghost was no longer hiding in the mountains. Good. Let him know she was coming. Let him spend sleepless nights wondering when and where she would strike. Outside, Patricia untied Black Tusk and swung into the saddle, the familiar motion as natural as breathing. The stallion sensed her mood dancing sideways as she turned him toward the trail that led out of town. They had work to do, preparations to make. The hunt was about to begin in earnest. As they climbed toward the high country, Patricia thought about the men and women who would answer her call. Christine Gray, the best tracker in 3 territories. Betty Bailey, who could put 6 shots through a playing card at 50 yards. Sandra Garcia, who knew every secret trail and hidden valley in the mountains. Lisa Ortiz, whose skill with explosives had earned her a reputation that stretched from California to Colorado. They had all served together during the territorial wars, had forged bonds stronger than blood in the crucible of shared danger. Some had retired like Patricia, trading badges for peaceful lives and quiet dreams. Others had drifted into private work, selling their skills to the highest bidder. But all of them remembered the code they had sworn to uphold, the promise that justice would find its way to those who thought themselves above the law. The territory ghost was riding again, and she would not ride alone. 2 days later, they began to arrive. Christine Gray came first, appearing at Patricia's cabin like smoke given form. She moved through the forest without disturbing a single leaf, her moccasined feet finding purchase on stone and root, with the silent grace of someone who had learned tracking from the Apache before the wars drove them from their ancestral lands. Her dark hair was streaked with silver now, and lines mapped the corners of her eyes, but her movements retained the fluid economy of a born hunter. "Patricia," she said simply, stepping onto the porch as if she had never been away. "Christine," Patricia replied, embracing her old friend. "Thank you for coming. You sent the coin." "That means blood debt. Blood debt means we ride until it is paid." Betty Bailey arrived at sunset, her horse lathered from hard riding. She had come from Denver, where she worked as a private investigator for clients who required discretion and results. Her red hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her green eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had killed more men than she cared to count. The matched Colts on her hips were worn smooth from years of practice, their grips shaped to her hands like extensions of her will. "Heard you were having trouble with Lewis Clark," she said, dismounting with the fluid grace of someone born to the saddle. "Trouble found me," Patricia replied. "I am simply returning the favor." Sandra Garcia rode in with the dawn, her approach announced by the soft whinny of recognition from Black Tusk. She had been Patricia's scout during the territorial campaigns, the woman who could find water in the desert and shelter in the storm. Her knowledge of the mountain country was encyclopedic, every trail and hidden valley mapped in her memory with cartographer's precision. "The old network remembers," she said, swinging down from her paint mare. "Word has gone out through channels Clark does not know exist. His operation is bigger than we thought, Patricia. He has men in every major town, judges and politicians in his pocket. This will not be easy." "Easy was never the point," Patricia replied. "Justice is the point. Everything else is just details." Lisa Ortiz came last, arriving in a supply wagon that looked ordinary enough until you noticed how carefully it was loaded. She had been the unit's demolitions expert, the woman who could bring down a bridge with a handful of dynamite or level a building with surgical precision. Her dark eyes sparkled with the same dangerous intelligence that had made her invaluable during their martial days. "Brought some party favors," she said, patting the side of her wagon. "Figured you might need them before this is over." That evening, they sat around Patricia's kitchen table like old times, sharing coffee and planning the kind of operation that had made them legends in law enforcement circles. The years had changed them all, had added gray to their hair and lines to their faces, but the core competence remained. They were still the most dangerous women in the territory, and Lewis Clark was about to learn why. Mark Myers had done his job well, gathering intelligence through the network of former lawmen and honest citizens who still remembered what justice looked like. Clark's operation was extensive, reaching into mining, cattle, and territorial politics with the tentacles of a vast criminal enterprise. He owned 3 judges, 2 sheriffs, and enough politicians to block any legal challenge to his authority. But he had made enemies too, people who had suffered under his rule and waited for someone with the skill and courage to challenge his power. They would provide safe houses and information, supplies, and support for the women who had come to settle accounts with the territorial king. Clark himself lived in a fortified compound outside the territorial capital, surrounded by hired guns and protected by layers of legal and political immunity. He had survived 3 assassination attempts and countless legal challenges, emerging stronger each time through a combination of violence and corruption that had made him untouchable. Until now. Patricia spread a hand-drawn map across the table, showing the approaches to Clark's compound and the positions of his guards. Lisa studied it with professional interest, her finger tracing potential demolition points and escape routes. Betty calculated fields of fire and cover positions. Christine identified tracking challenges and evasion routes. Sandra marked water sources and hidden trails. "We hit him at dawn," Patricia said finally, "fast and hard, before he can bring his full strength to bear. The goal is Clark himself. Everything else is secondary." "What about afterward?" Betty asked. "Even if we succeed, his organization will not simply disappear. They will come after us, after our families. Then we make sure they understand the cost of that choice," Patricia replied. "The territory ghost has a reputation for a reason. Sometimes fear is the only language men like Clark understand." They spent the night checking weapons and equipment, each woman preparing in her own way for the battle to come. Patricia cleaned and loaded her guns with the methodical precision of ritual, each cartridge inspected and each mechanism tested until everything functioned with mechanical perfection. As dawn approached, they mounted their horses and rode toward destiny. 5 women against an army, justice against corruption, the past riding to settle accounts with the present. The territory ghost was no longer alone, and the legend was about to become terrible reality. Behind them, the mountains watched in silence, ancient witnesses to human folly and the price of underestimating those who had nothing left to lose. The compound squatted on a mesa like a feudal castle, its walls built from local stone and crowned with guard towers that commanded the approaches from every direction. Lewis Clark had chosen his fortress well, a position that could be defended by a handful of men against an army. But he had not counted on facing the territory ghost and her allies, women who had spent years learning to turn impossible odds into inevitable victory. Patricia and her team approached in the pre-dawn darkness, their horses moving with the silent precision of shadows given form. They had left Black Tusk and the other mounts in a hidden canyon 2 miles away, proceeding on foot through terrain that would challenge mountain goats. Christine led the way, her knowledge of the country allowing them to avoid the obvious approaches where Clark's sentries waited with rifles and lanterns. The compound's weakness lay not in its walls but in its isolation. Clark had built his fortress far from any town or settlement, relying on distance and difficulty of approach for protection. But isolation worked both ways, and help was hours away even if his men managed to send word of the attack. Lisa Ortiz had spent the previous day preparing her special gifts, charges placed with mathematical precision at the base of the compound's water tower and main gate. The explosions would come exactly 3 minutes apart, creating confusion and drawing defenders away from the real target. Clark himself would be in the main house, a 2-story structure built like a medieval keep in the center of the compound. Patricia checked her pocket watch in the faint starlight. 5 minutes to dawn, 5 minutes until the reckoning began. She looked at each of her companions, seeing her own determination reflected in their faces. They had all lost something to men like Clark, had all watched corruption triumph while justice stood helpless. Today they would balance the scales regardless of the personal cost. The first explosion lit the sky like a miniature sun, the water tower collapsing in a cascade of timber and metal that shook the ground for miles. Shouts erupted from the compound as guards rushed toward the destruction, their attention focused on the obvious threat while death approached from an unexpected direction. Patricia and Betty Bailey moved through the chaos like avenging angels, their matched colts speaking in unison as they cleared the guard towers with surgical precision. Each shot found its target. Each target fell without a sound. The territory ghost had returned to her element, and she had forgotten nothing of the deadly arts that had made her legend. Christine Grace scaled the compound's wall like a spider, her rope and grapnel carrying her over the stone barrier in seconds. She landed in the courtyard and immediately began hunting sentries, her knife finding throats with the silent efficiency of a predator born. Sandra Garcia followed, her own blade gleaming in the firelight as she cleared the way for the final assault. The second explosion destroyed the main gate, sending wooden beams and iron hinges flying like shrapnel. More guards rushed toward the breach, leaving the main house lightly defended as Lisa Ortiz had calculated. Patricia and Betty approached the building from the rear, their movements coordinated with the precision of dancers who had performed this deadly ballet many times before. Inside the house, Lewis Clark was shouting orders at his remaining men, his voice carrying the edge of panic that came with the realization that his carefully constructed empire was crumbling around him. He had built his power on the assumption that money and influence could protect him from any threat, that the law was something he could buy and sell like any other commodity. But the territory ghost answered to a higher law, one written in blood and enforced with bullets. She came for him through smoke and flame, her Colt peacemaker in her hand and death in her eyes. His hired killers tried to stop her, professional gunmen who had never failed to earn their money. They died where they stood, cut down by a woman who had forgotten more about killing than they had ever learned. Clark waited in his study, a nickel-plated revolver trembling in his soft hands as Patricia kicked down the door. He was a small man, made smaller by fear and the sudden understanding that all his wealth and power meant nothing in the face of true justice. His expensive clothes were rumpled, his face pale with the knowledge of his approaching doom. "You cannot do this," he stammered, the gun wavering in his grip. "I am protected by law, by influential friends. Kill me, and you will hang for murder." Patricia stepped into the room with the calm confidence of someone who had faced death so many times that it held no terror. "Your friends are not here, Lewis. Your law means nothing in this place. There is only you and me and the debt you owe for the men you sent to kill an innocent woman." Clark fired wildly, his shots going wide as panic destroyed his aim. Patricia did not even flinch, her own weapon steady as stone as she took careful aim. The Colt bucked once in her hand, the heavy bullet taking Clark's center mass and dropping him behind his mahogany desk. She walked around the desk and looked down at the man who had thought himself untouchable. Blood stained his white shirt, spreading across his chest like a crimson flower. His eyes were already glazing, the light fading as his empire died with him. "Justice," Patricia said quietly. "Not revenge, not murder. Justice for all the innocent people you killed or destroyed in your greed for power." Clark tried to speak, his lips moving soundlessly as life fled his body. Patricia holstered her weapon and turned away, leaving him to die alone in the ruins of his ambition. Outside, the compound burned as Lisa's charges continued their work of destruction, erasing the physical symbols of Clark's power from the face of the earth. The five women regrouped at their horses as the sun rose over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Behind them, smoke rose from the burning compound like a funeral pyre for corruption itself. They had accomplished what the law could not, had brought justice to a place where justice had been bought and sold like any other commodity. The territory ghost had ridden again, and the legend was complete.